October 18, 1944. Dawn was breaking over the Philippine Sea as Lieutenant Commander William Post adjusted his periscope aboard the USS Gudgeon. The submarine had been patrolling these waters for 3 weeks, part of the massive Allied offensive during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval engagement in history. Through the periscope, Post could see the silhouettes of American destroyers on the horizon, their grey hulls cutting through the morning mist. The Gudgeon was on her 12th war patrol, a veteran submarine with a distinguished combat record. She had sunk Japanese merchant vessels, rescued downed airmen, and completed countless reconnaissance missions. Her crew of 79 men had become a tight-knit family, bound together by the unique brotherhood that forms in the cramped quarters of a submarine at war. Many were barely out of their teens: farm boys from Iowa, factory workers from Detroit, fishermen from New England, all united in their service to a nation fighting for its survival. At 8:47 hours, Post transmitted his final radio message to Naval Headquarters. Position confirmed, proceeding to assigned patrol sector, all systems operational. The message was received and acknowledged by the communications officer aboard the USS Wasatch, the command ship coordinating submarine operations in the area. It would be the last anyone would hear from the USS Gudgeon. As the morning progressed, Post positioned his submarine for what would become its final dive. The crew went about their routine duties, unaware that they were living their last hours. Seaman First Class Robert Chen from San Francisco was writing a letter to his girlfriend. Torpedoman James Murphy from Boston was cleaning his equipment. Chief Petty Officer Frank Kowalski from Chicago was calculating their position on the navigation charts. These ordinary moments of naval life were about to be shattered by an extraordinary tragedy. The waters around Leyte Gulf were crowded with Allied vessels, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, aircraft carriers, and submarines, all maneuvering in a complex dance of war. Communication between units was crucial, but in the chaos of battle, with radio silence often required and identification systems primitive by today's standards, the potential for catastrophic mistakes lurked beneath every order. At approximately 10:30 hours, sonar operators aboard several American destroyers detected what they identified as a submarine contact. In the fog of war, with Japanese submarines known to be operating in the area, the contact was immediately classified as hostile. The Gudgeon, running submerged according to her patrol orders, had no way of knowing that she had been misidentified by her own navy. What happened next would remain buried in classified files for 8 decades, a secret so shameful that the United States Navy would choose to let 79 families live in agonizing uncertainty rather than admit the truth. The Gudgeon was not destroyed by enemy action, as her families would be told. She was not lost to a mine or mechanical failure, as official reports would suggest. She was killed by friendly fire, depth charges dropped by American destroyers who mistook their own submarine for an enemy vessel. The truth of that October morning would remain hidden in the deepest archives of naval intelligence, protected by classifications that outlasted the Cold War, outlasted the men who made the decision to cover it up, and outlasted most of the families who spent their lives searching for answers that were always within the government's reach. To understand the magnitude of what was lost that October morning, we must first understand who these men were. The USS Gudgeon carried 79 souls into those Philippine waters, 79 stories, 79 families, 79 futures that would be cut short by a mistake that should never have happened. Lieutenant Commander William Post, the submarine's captain, was a 32-year-old career naval officer from Connecticut. He had graduated from the Naval Academy in 1934 and had spent his entire adult life in service to his country. Post was known for his methodical approach to submarine warfare and his deep concern for his crew's welfare. His wife, Margaret, was 6 months pregnant with their second child when the Gudgeon departed for her final patrol. She would give birth to a son who would never know his father. The executive officer, Lieutenant Robert Manning, came from a long line of Navy men. His grandfather had served in the Spanish-American War, his father in World War I. At 28, Manning was considered one of the most promising young officers in the submarine service. His letters home to his parents in Virginia spoke of his pride in serving aboard the Gudgeon and his confidence in their mission. His mother would keep those letters in a wooden box for the rest of her life, reading them whenever the pain of his loss became unbearable. Among the enlisted men was Chief Petty Officer Frank Kowalski, a Polish immigrant son from Chicago who had joined the Navy to escape the poverty of the Depression. At 35, he was one of the older men aboard, a father figure to many of the younger sailors. Kowalski sent half his pay home to support his widowed mother and 3 younger sisters. His family would wait for years for him to return, never fully accepting that he was gone. Seaman First Class Robert Chen represented the changing face of America. The son of Chinese immigrants who ran a small restaurant in San Francisco's Chinatown, Chen had enlisted after Pearl Harbor despite facing discrimination and suspicion because of his Asian heritage. His service aboard the Gudgeon was proof of his patriotism and his determination to defend the country he loved. His parents would spend the rest of their lives wondering if their son had been treated with the respect he deserved, even in death. Torpedoman James Murphy was just 19 years old, a red-haired Irish kid from South Boston who had lied about his age to enlist. His mother had begged him to wait until his 18th birthday, but Murphy was determined to serve. He sent cheerful letters home describing life aboard the submarine, always assuring his family that he was safe and that the war would be over soon. His mother would never recover from his loss, dying just 5 years later, friends said of a broken heart. The youngest man aboard was seaman apprentice David Richardson, who had turned 18 just 2 weeks before the Gudgeon's final patrol. A farm boy from Nebraska, Richardson had never seen the ocean before joining the Navy. His letters home described the wonder of submarine service with the enthusiasm of youth. His father would spend decades writing to the Navy Department, demanding to know exactly what had happened to his boy. These men shared the unique intimacy of submarine service. In the confined spaces of their underwater world, privacy was impossible and pretense useless. They knew each other's habits, fears, dreams, and secrets. They had survived depth charge attacks, equipment failures, and the constant psychological pressure of operating beneath the sea. They trusted each other with their lives every day, and they trusted their Navy to use their sacrifice wisely. The crew's morale was high as they entered what would be their final patrol. They had received mail from home just before departure, and many were already making plans for shore leave in Australia. Several men had been recommended for promotion, and there was talk that the Gudgeon might be assigned to the safer waters of the Eastern Pacific after this mission. The war seemed to be turning in America's favor, and there was a growing sense that they might all make it home. They had no way of knowing that their own Navy was about to destroy them. Now, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching us from and the exact time you're listening to this story. We're interested to know to which places and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. As the USS Gudgeon descended into the depths of the Philippine Sea on that October morning, the surface above was alive with the controlled chaos of the largest naval battle in history. The Battle of Leyte Gulf involved over 200,000 personnel and nearly 300 ships spread across an area larger than England. In this massive theater of operations, identification of friend from foe was a constant challenge that tested the limits of 1940s technology and human judgment. Admiral William "Bull" Halsey's Third Fleet was operating in close coordination with Admiral Thomas Kinkaid's Seventh Fleet, but communication between the two commands was often delayed or incomplete. Submarine positions were tracked on plotting boards aboard command ships, but the system was far from perfect. Updates were slow, positions were approximate, and in the heat of battle, mistakes were inevitable. The destroyer USS Fletcher, under the command of Commander Thomas Wilson, was part of an anti-submarine screen protecting the fleet's eastern approaches. Wilson was a veteran officer who had survived 2 years of Pacific combat, but the stress of constant vigilance was wearing on him and his crew. They had been at battle stations for 18 hours, their nerves frayed by repeated sonar contacts and the ever-present threat of Japanese submarine attack. At 10:25 hours, sonarman Second Class Michael Torres detected what appeared to be a submarine contact, bearing 270 degrees range approximately 3,000 yards. Torres was a 22-year-old from San Antonio, Texas, whose acute hearing had made him one of the best sonar operators in the fleet. But even the best operators could make mistakes when exhaustion and adrenaline clouded their judgment. Contact, bearing 270, moving left to right, speed approximately 4 knots, Torres reported to the bridge. The signature on his sonar screen looked similar to contacts they had engaged before, the distinctive sound pattern of a submarine running submerged. What Torres couldn't know was that he was listening to the USS Gudgeon, following her assigned patrol route exactly as ordered. Commander Wilson faced a split-second decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Intelligence reports had warned of Japanese submarine activity in the area. Several Allied ships had been torpedoed in recent days, and the pressure to prevent further attacks was enormous. The submarine contact was in an area where no friendly submarines were supposed to be operating, or so Wilson believed. The reality was more complex. The Gudgeon's patrol area had been modified at the last minute due to changing tactical situations, but this information had not been properly communicated to all surface units. The submarine was exactly where she was supposed to be, but the Fletcher's crew had no way of knowing this. The fog of war had created a deadly gap in communication that would cost 79 American lives. "General quarters, all hands to battle stations," Wilson ordered. The Fletcher's crew rushed to their positions, adrenaline pumping as they prepared to engage what they believed was an enemy submarine. In the sonar room, Torres continued to track the contact, providing bearing and range updates to the bridge. The submarine appeared to be maneuvering slowly, possibly setting up for an attack. Wilson attempted to radio the contact and order it to surface and identify itself, but the Gudgeon was maintaining radio silence as required by her patrol orders. The lack of response only confirmed Wilson's suspicion that he was dealing with an enemy submarine. Time was running out. If this was indeed a Japanese boat, every second of delay increased the risk to his ship and the fleet. The decision to attack was made in accordance with standing orders and proper military procedure. Wilson had followed protocol exactly, but protocol was based on imperfect information and a communication system that had failed at the worst possible moment. The tragedy that was about to unfold was not the result of cowardice or incompetence, but of the inevitable imperfections in the machinery of war. At 10:34 hours, Wilson gave the order that would seal the fate of the USS Gudgeon. "Commence depth charge attack. Set pattern, Charlie. Fire when ready." The Fletcher's depth charge crews sprang into action, loading the cylindrical explosive devices onto their launching tracks. Each depth charge contained 600 pounds of TNT, set to explode at predetermined depths. Pattern Charlie called for a rectangular spread of charges designed to bracket a submarine and destroy it through the massive pressure waves created by underwater explosions. Below the surface, the crew of the Gudgeon continued their routine patrol, unaware that death was raining down upon them from their own navy. Lieutenant Commander Post was reviewing navigation charts in the control room. The crew was preparing for the noon meal. In a few minutes, they would all be dead, victims of the most tragic friendly fire incident in submarine warfare history. The truth of what happened next would be immediately classified and buried so deeply that it would take 80 years and a chance archaeological discovery to bring it to light. The first depth charge exploded at 10:36 hours, its thunderous detonation sending shockwaves through the water that could be felt on ships miles away. Aboard the Fletcher, the crew cheered as they watched the massive column of water and foam erupt from the sea. They believed they were avenging their fallen comrades and protecting their fleet from enemy attack. They had no idea they had just committed fratricide on an unimaginable scale. The USS Gudgeon was cruising at a depth of 150 feet when the explosions began. The first charge detonated close enough to buckle her hull plates and shatter gauges throughout the submarine. Emergency lighting flickered on as the main electrical systems failed. In the control room, Lieutenant Commander Post immediately ordered the submarine to emergency surface, but it was already too late. The second and third charges exploded in rapid succession, their combined force crushing the Gudgeon's pressure hull like an aluminum can. Water rushed through massive ruptures in her sides, and the submarine began her final dive to the ocean floor 600 feet below. The men aboard had perhaps 30 seconds to comprehend what was happening before the crushing depth and drowning darkness claimed them all. Chief Petty Officer Kowalski was in the engine room when the attack began. The experienced submariner immediately recognized the sound of depth charges, but in those final moments he may have wondered why no enemy contact had been reported. Seaman Chen was in the torpedo room, probably trying to understand why they were under attack when no battle station's alarm had been sounded. Torpedo Man Murphy might have had time to realize that something was terribly wrong, that these explosions were too close, too accurate, too devastating to be random enemy fire. On the surface, the Fletcher continued her attack, dropping a total of 16 depth charges in what appeared to be a textbook anti-submarine engagement. Debris rose to the surface, pieces of wood, oil slicks, and metal fragments that seemed to confirm a successful kill. Commander Wilson radioed his superiors. Submarine contact destroyed, large debris field observed, no survivors detected. The celebration aboard the Fletcher was short-lived. Within hours, disturbing questions began to emerge. A review of submarine positions showed that a friendly boat, the USS Gudgeon, had been operating in the attack area. Radio operators confirmed that the Gudgeon had failed to respond to scheduled communication checks. As the horrible realization dawned, the celebration turned to horror. Commander Wilson was immediately relieved of command and placed under investigation. The Fletcher's crew was sworn to secrecy, and all records of the engagement were classified at the highest levels. Within 24 hours, a cover story was already being constructed. The Gudgeon had been lost to enemy action, the official reports would state. The specific details would remain classified for reasons of national security. The decision to cover up the friendly fire incident was made at the highest levels of naval command. Admiral Chester Nimitz himself was briefed on the situation and faced an agonizing choice. The truth would devastate morale at a critical moment in the Pacific campaign. It would provide propaganda ammunition to the enemy. It would destroy the careers of good officers who had made an honest mistake in the fog of war. Most importantly, from the Navy's perspective, it would serve no purpose. The 79 men of the Gudgeon were already dead. No amount of truth-telling would bring them back, but the damage to the war effort could be enormous. The decision was made to classify the incident and create a cover story that would protect both national security and institutional reputation. The families of the Gudgeon's crew received telegrams informing them that their loved ones were missing in action following an enemy engagement. The details were classified, the telegrams explained, but the men had died heroically in service to their country. The Navy Department would provide additional information when possible, but families should not expect detailed accounts due to the sensitive nature of submarine operations. For Margaret Post, the telegram arrived on a cold November morning in Connecticut. She was hanging laundry in her backyard, 7 months pregnant with a child her husband would never see. The Western Union delivery boy was barely 16, and he cried as he handed her the telegram. Margaret read it twice before the words registered, then sank to her knees in the frost-covered grass. In Chicago, Frank Kowalski's mother received her telegram in Polish from a neighbor who translated the bureaucratic language of military death. She had fled Poland to escape war, only to lose her eldest son to war on the other side of the world. She would spend her remaining years lighting candles for a son whose grave she would never visit. The Chen family in San Francisco received their telegram at their restaurant during the lunch rush. Robert's father had to close the restaurant for a week, unable to work through his grief. The Chinese-American community had sacrificed much for the war effort, and Robert's death seemed to prove that their loyalty and patriotism were recognized and valued. They had no idea their son had been killed by his own Navy. These families, like the other 76 families of the Gudgeon's crew, would spend the rest of their lives seeking answers that were locked away in classified files. They would write letters, make phone calls, visit government offices, and hire private investigators. They would be told repeatedly that the details of their loved ones' deaths were classified for national security reasons, but that they should be proud of their sacrifice. The cover-up was so complete that even most Navy personnel believed the official story. The Gudgeon had been lost to enemy action during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, one of many submarines that never returned from patrol. Her name was added to memorial walls, and her crew honored as heroes who died fighting the enemy. The truth remained buried in a handful of classified files, known only to a small group of senior officers who took the secret to their graves. The years following the war brought little comfort to the families of the USS Gudgeon. As America celebrated victory and veterans returned home to parades and prosperity, 79 families remained trapped in a limbo of unanswered questions. The official story never wavered. The Gudgeon had been lost to enemy action in the Philippine Sea. The details remained classified, but the families were assured their loved ones had died as heroes. Margaret Post gave birth to her son, William Jr., in January 1945, 3 months after receiving news of her husband's death. She named the boy after his father and spent years telling him stories about the submarine commander he would never know. William Jr. grew up believing his father had been killed by Japanese depth charges while defending American ships. The boy kept his father's Naval Academy ring in a wooden box beside his bed and dreamed of following in his footsteps. As William Jr. entered his teens in the 1950s, he began asking more detailed questions about his father's death. Margaret contacted the Navy Department repeatedly, requesting more information about the circumstances of the Gudgeon's loss. Each inquiry received the same response. The details remained classified for national security reasons, but she should be proud that her husband died serving his country with honor. The form letters from the Navy Department became increasingly frustrating. They offered sympathy and appreciation, but no substance. Margaret began to suspect that there was more to the story than she had been told. She hired a private investigator in 1958, a former Navy intelligence officer, who promised to uncover the truth about her husband's death. After 6 months of investigation, he returned her money and advised her to stop looking. Some secrets, he told her, were too dangerous to uncover. In Chicago, Frank Kowalski's sister Anna had taken over the family's search for answers. She had become a nurse after the war and used her medical connections to try to access military records. Anna discovered that several other submarines lost during the war had eventually had their stories declassified, but the Gudgeon remained shrouded in secrecy. She began corresponding with other families of the crew, creating an informal network of people seeking the same answers. The Kowalski family's search led them to hire an attorney in 1963, hoping that legal pressure might force the Navy to release more information. The attorney filed Freedom of Information Act requests and threatened litigation, but the military's response was always the same. The information was classified and would remain so indefinitely. The attorney eventually advised the family that further legal action would be futile and expensive. David Richardson's father never stopped writing letters. The Nebraska farmer had completed only 8th grade, but his letters to congressmen, senators, and Navy officials were eloquent pleas for basic information about his son's death. He kept carbon copies of every letter and filed every response in a cardboard box that eventually filled an entire dresser drawer. Most responses were form letters, but a few officials took the time to offer personal condolences while explaining that their hands were tied by classification requirements. Richardson's persistence eventually attracted the attention of Senator George Norris, who made personal inquiries on the family's behalf. Even Norris, a senior member of the Armed Services Committee, was told that the Gudgeon's loss involved classified operations that could not be discussed. The senator's staff suggested that Richardson might have better luck in 20 or 30 years, when the records might be declassified for historical purposes. The family's frustration was compounded by the changing nature of military secrecy. As the Cold War intensified, classification policies became even more restrictive. Information that might have been released in the 1950s remained locked away in the 1960s and 1970s. The Gudgeon's families began to suspect that their loved ones had been involved in some kind of special operation, perhaps intelligence gathering or covert warfare, that required permanent secrecy. This speculation only made their loss more painful. They imagined their men dying on secret missions of vital importance, their sacrifice known only to a handful of officials who could never acknowledge their heroism publicly. The reality that they had been killed by friendly fire in a tragic mistake never occurred to them because such accidents were supposedly impossible in the professional military they trusted. By the 1970s, many of the original family members were aging or deceased. Margaret Post had remarried and moved to Florida, but she never stopped wondering about her first husband's death. William Jr. had joined the Navy himself, hoping to uncover information about his father from within the system. He served honorably for 20 years, retiring as a lieutenant commander, but never learned any more about the Gudgeon than what was in the public record. The second generation began taking up the search in the 1980s. Children who had grown up without fathers became adults, determined to understand what had happened. They had access to better research tools and more sophisticated legal strategies, but they faced the same stone wall of classification that had frustrated their parents. The Cold War was ending, but the Gudgeon's secrets remained locked away. Some family members began to suspect a cover-up. The excessive secrecy, the refusal to declassify even basic operational details, and the military's obvious discomfort with questions about the Gudgeon suggested that something more complicated than enemy action had caused the submarine's loss. But they had no way to prove their suspicions, and no legal mechanism to force disclosure of classified information. If this case has already caught your attention, hit the like button. It helps Lieutenant Commander Post's story reach more people. As the new millennium approached, the families of the USS Gudgeon faced a heartbreaking reality. Most of the people who remembered their loved ones were dying. Wives had become widows, then elderly women, then memories themselves. Children who had grown up fatherless were now middle-aged, still seeking answers that seemed forever beyond their reach. The military's response to family inquiries had evolved over the decades, but the substance remained unchanged. Form letters now came from different departments with updated letterheads, but they still offered the same non-explanation. The loss of the USS Gudgeon involved classified operations that could not be discussed for reasons of national security. By 2000, this justification was wearing thin even to military bureaucrats who knew nothing about the real circumstances of the submarine's loss. William Post Jr. had become the unofficial leader of the family's search for truth. As a retired Navy officer himself, he understood military culture and had contacts throughout the submarine community. His own service had given him insight into how classification systems worked and how information could be protected indefinitely through bureaucratic inertia. He suspected that the original reasons for classifying his father's death had long since become irrelevant, but that no one wanted to take responsibility for changing the classification. In 2001, Post Jr. filed what he considered his final formal request for information about the USS Gudgeon. He was 56 years old, the same age his father had been when the submarine was lost, and he was tired of bureaucratic evasions. His letter to the Navy Department was direct and emotional. He wanted to know how his father died, not for any political or legal purpose, but simply for the peace of mind that truth could provide. The response came 6 months later, from a junior officer in the Naval Historical Center. It was more personal than the usual form letter, acknowledging Post Jr.'s service and expressing genuine sympathy for his loss. But the conclusion was familiar. The records of the USS Gudgeon's final patrol remained classified, and there was no timeline for their release. The officer suggested that Post Jr. might try again in 10 or 15 years, when changing security considerations might allow for greater transparency. Anna Kowalski had died in 1998, taking with her 60 years of unanswered questions about her brother Frank. Her nephew Michael had inherited her files, boxes of correspondence with government officials, newspaper clippings about submarine warfare, and photocopied pages from books about World War II naval operations. Michael was a computer programmer who understood how to use internet resources to research historical questions, but even his technical skills couldn't penetrate the wall of classification surrounding the Gudgeon. The internet age had brought new tools for historical research, but it had also revealed how much information about World War II remained classified. Websites dedicated to submarine warfare contained detailed accounts of most lost boats, but the Gudgeon's entry was notably sparse. Official histories mentioned her previous patrols, but provided no details about her final mission. The submarine seemed to have been deliberately erased from the historical record. Family members began connecting with each other through online forums and genealogy websites. They discovered that they all had the same questions and had received the same non-answers from the military bureaucracy. An informal support group developed, bound together by their shared frustration and their determination to honor their loved one's memory by uncovering the truth. The group's research revealed disturbing patterns. Other submarines lost during World War II had been memorialized with detailed accounts of their final battles. Families had received battle reports, survivor testimony, and even recovered artifacts. But the Gudgeon families had received none of this. Their loved ones seemed to have vanished, not just from the ocean but from history itself. By 2010, some family members were beginning to suspect that their relatives had been killed not by enemy action, but by some kind of accident or friendly fire incident. This possibility was almost too painful to consider, but it would explain the excessive secrecy and the military's obvious reluctance to discuss the circumstances of the loss. If American forces had been responsible for the Gudgeon's destruction, the cover-up would make sense from an institutional perspective, even if it was morally inexcusable. The friendly fire theory gained credibility when researchers discovered that several similar incidents had been declassified in recent years. The military had admitted to accidents that killed American personnel when the strategic value of secrecy had expired. But the Gudgeon remained classified, suggesting that something about this particular incident was deemed too sensitive for public disclosure. Margaret Post had died in 2005, taking her secrets and her sorrow to the grave. She had spent 60 years wondering how her husband died, and the wondering had become a defining characteristic of her personality. Her second husband later told William Jr. that she had never fully committed to their marriage because part of her remained connected to the missing submarine commander she had lost in the war. The psychological toll of unanswered questions had affected all the families. Children had grown up sensing that there was something unresolved about their father's deaths, something that made their loss different from other war casualties. The excessive secrecy had created a wound that couldn't heal, a grief that couldn't be properly processed because the truth remained hidden. As the 70th anniversary of the Gudgeon's loss approached in 2014, the remaining family members made one final coordinated effort to obtain information. They hired an attorney who specialized in Freedom of Information Act litigation and submitted a comprehensive request for all records related to the submarine. The attorney warned them that success was unlikely, but they felt they owed it to their deceased relatives to make one last attempt. The government's response was swift and decisive. All records relating to the USS Gudgeon's final patrol remained classified and would continue to be classified indefinitely. No timeline for declassification could be provided, and no additional information could be released. The family's attorney advised them that further legal action would be futile and expensive. By 2020, most of the Gudgeon's children were elderly themselves. The generation that had grown up without fathers was now facing their own mortality, and the questions that had haunted their families for decades remained unanswered. They began to accept that they might die without ever knowing the truth about their loved one's fate, just as their mothers had died in ignorance. The military's strategy of simply waiting for the families to give up or die off seemed to be succeeding. The institutional memory of the Gudgeon's true fate was probably limited to a handful of classified files that might never be opened. The cover-up had lasted so long that it had become self-perpetuating, protected by bureaucratic inertia and the natural human reluctance to admit catastrophic mistakes. But beneath the Pacific Ocean, physical evidence of the truth was waiting to be discovered. The breakthrough that would finally expose the USS Gudgeon's secret came not from government files or family research, but from the depths of the Philippine Sea itself. In 2023, the deep-sea exploration vessel Ocean Discoverer was conducting a survey of World War II shipwrecks when her sonar detected an unusual signature on the seafloor, approximately 600 feet below the surface in an area that had seen heavy fighting during the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Dr. Sarah Martinez, a marine archaeologist leading the expedition, initially thought they had found another Japanese shipwreck. The Philippines' waters were littered with vessels from both sides of the conflict, and her team had already documented dozens of previously unknown wrecks. But as the remotely operated vehicle descended to investigate, the images transmitted to the surface told a different story. The wreck was unmistakably American, a Gato-class submarine lying upright on the sandy bottom, her hull split open by what appeared to be massive explosive damage. The submarine's conning tower was relatively intact, and cameras were able to capture clear images of her hull number, SS-211. Dr. Martinez consulted her reference materials and felt her heart skip a beat. SS-211 was the USS Gudgeon, officially lost to enemy action in October 1944. But the physical evidence told a story that contradicted the official record. The damage patterns on the Gudgeon's hull were not consistent with torpedo strikes or mine explosions. Instead, the submarine showed the characteristic signatures of depth charge attacks, multiple ruptures caused by underwater explosions that had occurred above and around the vessel. Even more disturbing, analysis of the debris field revealed fragments of American-manufactured depth charges. Dr. Martinez had studied enough World War II wrecks to recognize friendly fire damage when she saw it. The Gudgeon had been destroyed by American depth charges, not by enemy action. The submarine had been killed by her own navy, and the truth had been covered up for nearly 80 years. The discovery created an immediate dilemma for the research team. They were working under permits that required them to report all findings to both Philippine and American authorities. But Dr. Martinez realized that she might be holding evidence of one of the most significant cover-ups in military history. The implications were staggering, not just for the historical record, but for the families who had spent decades seeking answers about their loved ones' deaths. After consulting with her team and legal advisors, Dr. Martinez decided to document everything before making any official reports. The Ocean Discoverer spent 3 days creating a complete photographic and video record of the wreck site. They recovered small artifacts that had spilled from the submarine's hull, personal items that would help confirm the vessel's identity and the circumstances of her loss. Among the recovered items was a waterlogged but readable nameplate from the submarine's torpedo room, confirming beyond doubt that this was the USS Gudgeon. More significantly, they found fragments of depth charge casings embedded in the submarine's hull plating. Chemical analysis would later confirm that these fragments came from Mark 7 depth charges, standard American anti-submarine weapons used by U.S. destroyers during World War II. The physical evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. The USS Gudgeon had been destroyed by American depth charges in a friendly fire incident that had been covered up for 8 decades. The 79 men who died aboard the submarine had been killed not by enemy action, but by their own Navy's tragic mistake. Dr. Martinez faced a difficult decision about how to release this information. A premature announcement might allow the military to suppress the evidence or discredit the findings, but delaying publication would mean continued suffering for any surviving family members who were still seeking answers. She decided to contact William Post, Jr. directly, reasoning that the families deserved to hear the truth before anyone else. The phone call came on a quiet Tuesday morning in March 2024. Post Jr., now 79 years old, was gardening in his backyard when his wife called him to the phone. Dr. Martinez introduced herself and explained that she had discovered the wreck of his father's submarine. Post Jr. listened in stunned silence as she described the evidence of friendly fire and the decades-long cover-up. "Are you absolutely certain it was friendly fire?" Post Jr. asked, his voice barely steady. "There's no doubt," Dr. Martinez replied. "The damage patterns, the depth charge fragments, the location, everything confirms that the Gudgeon was destroyed by American forces. I'm so sorry that your family has had to wait 80 years for this answer." Post Jr. sat down heavily in his kitchen chair, trying to process information that would reshape his understanding of his father's death and his own life. The heroic narrative he had believed for 8 decades was false. His father and 78 other men had died not in glorious combat with the enemy, but in a tragic accident that the Navy had chosen to cover up rather than acknowledge. Within days, Dr. Martinez had contacted other surviving family members. Michael Kowalski, Anna's nephew, was at work when the call came. Sarah Chen Williams, the daughter of Seaman Robert Chen, was making dinner for her grandchildren. James Murphy Jr., the son who had been born 3 months after his father's death, was watching television with his wife. Each conversation followed the same pattern: initial disbelief, then anger, then a strange sense of relief that the truth had finally emerged. The families had suspected for years that the official story was incomplete, but they had never imagined friendly fire. The revelation was devastating and liberating at the same time. Devastating because it revealed the magnitude of the military's betrayal, but liberating because the decades of questions finally had answers. The families decided to coordinate their response to the discovery. They wanted the truth to be told publicly, but they also wanted to ensure that their loved ones were properly honored despite the circumstances of their deaths. The 79 men of the USS Gudgeon were still heroes who had served their country with courage and dedication. The fact that they had been killed by friendly fire didn't diminish their sacrifice. It only made the cover-up more inexcusable. In June 2024, Dr. Martinez published her findings in the Journal of Maritime Archaeology, accompanied by a detailed technical analysis of the wreck site and the evidence of friendly fire. The article was carefully written to present the facts without sensationalism, but the implications were explosive. The USS Gudgeon had been destroyed by American forces, and the U.S. Navy had covered up the incident for 80 years. The publication of the archaeological evidence forced the Navy Department to respond. After 80 years of denial and deflection, military officials could no longer maintain that the Gudgeon's loss was classified for national security reasons. The physical evidence from the ocean floor had made further deception impossible. The Navy's initial response to Dr. Martinez's publication was predictably defensive. A terse press release acknowledged that the service was reviewing new information about the USS Gudgeon, but made no admission of wrongdoing or cover-up. Military spokesmen declined to comment on specific details, citing the need to respect the ongoing review process and the sensitive nature of historical wartime operations. But the families of the Gudgeon's crew were no longer willing to accept bureaucratic evasions. Armed with undeniable physical evidence and 80 years of accumulated anger, they launched a coordinated campaign to force full disclosure of the incident. William Post Jr., despite his advanced age, became the public face of their effort, giving interviews to newspapers and television stations across the country. "My father and 78 other men died serving their country," Post Jr. told a reporter from the Washington Post. "They deserved better than to be killed by their own Navy, and they certainly deserved better than to have their deaths covered up for 8 decades. Their families deserved the truth, not lies and bureaucratic stonewalling." The story gained national attention as more details emerged about the cover-up. Investigative reporters began filing Freedom of Information Act requests and interviewing retired naval officers who might have knowledge of the incident. Several former submarine commanders came forward to express their outrage at the Navy's handling of the case. Captain Robert Sullivan, who had commanded submarines in the Pacific during World War II, told 60 Minutes that friendly fire incidents were the worst nightmare of every naval officer. But he emphasized that covering up such incidents was a betrayal of everything we stood for as professional military officers. Those families had a right to know how their loved ones died. The pressure on the Navy Department became intense as congressional representatives began demanding answers. Senator Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts, whose state had been home to several of the Gudgeon's crew members, called for a full investigation and immediate declassification of all records related to the incident. 80 years is long enough to keep families in the dark about their loved ones' deaths, Warren declared on the Senate floor. In September 2024, facing overwhelming political and public pressure, the Navy Department finally capitulated. Secretary of the Navy Carlos del Toro announced that all records relating to the USS Gudgeon would be declassified and released to the families and the public. In a carefully worded statement, del Toro acknowledged that mistakes were made in the handling of this tragic incident and offered the Navy's sincere apologies to the families who have suffered for so many years without answers. The declassified files, released in October 2024, exactly 80 years after the Gudgeon's destruction, revealed the full scope of the cover-up. The documents showed that senior naval officers had known within hours that the submarine had been destroyed by friendly fire, but had made a deliberate decision to classify the incident and create a false narrative about enemy action. The files included the original after-action report from the USS Fletcher, which clearly described the depth charge attack on what the destroyer's crew believed to be an enemy submarine. Commander Wilson's subsequent testimony revealed his horror upon learning that he had destroyed an American boat, and his willingness to accept full responsibility for the tragic mistake. More damaging were the records of high-level meetings where the decision to cover up the incident was made. Admiral Nimitz had been briefed on the friendly fire within 48 hours, and the decision to classify the information had been made at his level. The files revealed a cold calculation, admitting the mistake would damage morale and provide propaganda value to the enemy, while covering it up would harm only the families, who were considered expendable in the larger war effort. Perhaps most heartbreaking were the records of family inquiries over the decades. The files showed that military officials had known exactly what had happened to the Gudgeon while they were writing form letters to grieving families, claiming that details were classified for national security reasons. Bureaucrats had lied to widows and orphans for 8 decades, protecting an institutional secret that served no legitimate purpose after the war ended. The declassified documents also revealed the human cost of the cover-up within the military itself. Commander Wilson had suffered a nervous breakdown after learning that he had destroyed a friendly submarine and had never fully recovered from the psychological trauma. Several other officers involved in the incident had requested transfers or early retirement, unable to live with the knowledge of what had happened and their role in covering it up. The family's reaction to the declassified files was a mixture of vindication and rage. They had been right to suspect that the official story was false, but the scope of the deception was worse than they had imagined. The Navy had not simply withheld information, It had actively lied to them for 8 decades, creating and maintaining a false narrative that served only to protect institutional reputation. "They let my mother die without knowing the truth about her husband," said James Murphy, Jr., whose father had been the 19-year-old torpedo man from Boston. "She spent 60 years wondering if he had suffered, if he had been brave, if he had died well. She could have known that he died instantly in a tragic accident, but they chose to let her live with uncertainty and pain instead." The revelation also sparked a broader conversation about military accountability and the classification of historical information. Critics argued that the Gudgeon case demonstrated how classification systems could be abused to protect institutions rather than national security. If an 80-year-old friendly fire incident could remain classified indefinitely, what other military mistakes were being hidden from public scrutiny? Legal experts began discussing whether the families might have grounds for a lawsuit against the government. While the statute of limitations for most claims had long since expired, some argued that the active deception and cover-up might justify an exception. The families were less interested in monetary compensation than in official acknowledgement of the injustice they had suffered. In November 2024, Secretary Del Toro traveled to Arlington National Cemetery for a ceremony honoring the crew of the USS Gudgeon. Representatives of the families were present as Del Toro laid a wreath at the tomb of the unknown soldier and offered a formal apology for the Navy's handling of the incident. The 79 men who died aboard the USS Gudgeon were American heroes who served their country with courage and dedication, Del Toro said. They deserved better than to die in a tragic accident, and their families deserved better than 8 decades of deception and denial. Today we honor their sacrifice and pledge that such institutional failures will never happen again. But for many of the families, the apology felt hollow after 8 decades of deliberate deception. The men they had loved were still dead, killed by their own Navy in a mistake that had been covered up for longer than most of them had been alive. No amount of official regret could restore the years of uncertainty, the questions that had haunted their dreams, or the trust that had been betrayed by the institution they had served. As 2024 drew to a close, the families of the USS Gudgeon faced the complex task of rebuilding their understanding of their loved ones' deaths and their own family histories. The truth they had sought for 8 decades had finally emerged, but it brought as much pain as closure. The heroic narrative they had cherished, fathers and husbands dying in glorious combat against America's enemies, had been replaced by a more complicated reality of tragic accident and institutional betrayal. William Post Jr. spent his final months updating the family records he had maintained for decades. At 79, he was the same age his father had been when the submarine was lost, and he felt the weight of 8 decades of deception in every document he reviewed. Letters from the Navy Department that had once seemed sympathetic now read as calculated lies. Official commendations that had once brought comfort now felt like mockery. But Post Jr. also found unexpected peace in finally knowing the truth. His father had not died in agony, slowly drowning as his submarine filled with water. Lieutenant Commander William Post had died instantly when the USS Fletcher's depth charges crushed the Gudgeon's hull, along with his 78 shipmates. There had been no suffering, no time for fear, no awareness that they were being killed by their own Navy. "In a strange way, knowing about the friendly fire makes me feel closer to my father," Post Jr. told a reporter in one of his final interviews. "For 80 years I've been angry at the Japanese for killing him. Now I understand that he died in a tragic accident, killed by Americans who thought they were defending their fleet. There's no one to hate anymore. Just a terrible mistake that the Navy made worse by covering it up." The surviving family members worked together to create a proper memorial for the Gudgeon's crew. The submarine's name had been engraved on memorial walls at various naval installations, but always with the false notation that she had been lost to enemy action. The families petitioned to have these inscriptions corrected to reflect the true circumstances of the boat's loss. More importantly, they established a scholarship fund in memory of the 79 men who had died aboard the submarine. The USS Gudgeon Memorial Scholarship would support the education of military children, with a special emphasis on programs promoting military ethics and accountability. The families wanted something positive to emerge from their decades of suffering, some way to honor their loved ones while also preventing future cover-ups. Dr. Sarah Martinez's archaeological work had concluded with the creation of a detailed site map and artifact catalogue that would preserve the Gudgeon story for future generations. The submarine itself would remain on the ocean floor as a war grave, protected by international maritime law and marked with a memorial buoy that identified her as the resting place of 79 American servicemen. The broader implications of the Gudgeon case continued to reverberate through military and political circles. Congress held hearings on military classification policies and the handling of historical records. New regulations were implemented requiring periodic review of classified materials, with special attention to incidents involving friendly fire or military accidents. The case also sparked renewed interest in other mysterious military losses from World War II. Researchers began re-examining cases where official explanations seemed incomplete or where families had been denied information for unusually long periods. Several other friendly fire incidents were uncovered, though none had been covered up for as long as the Gudgeon case. For the families, the most difficult aspect of the truth was understanding how many people had participated in the deception over 8 decades. It wasn't just a handful of senior officers making a wartime decision. It was generations of military bureaucrats who had maintained the lie, writing form letters to grieving families while knowing exactly what had happened to their loved ones. Michael Kowalski, Frank's nephew, discovered that his Aunt Anna had actually come close to the truth in the 1970s. Her research had identified inconsistencies in the official timeline of the Gudgeon's loss, and she had suspected friendly fire as a possibility. But when she had shared her theories with a retired Navy officer, he had discouraged her from pursuing the matter further, warning that some secrets were too dangerous to uncover. The psychological impact of the revelation was complex and individual. Some family members felt relief that the mystery was finally solved. Others felt anger that bordered on rage at the institutional betrayal. A few experienced what psychologists called complicated grief, struggling to process the loss of their cherished narrative about their loved ones' heroic deaths. Sarah Chen Williams, the daughter of Seaman Robert Chen, found herself re-examining her entire family history in light of the truth. Her father had faced discrimination as a Chinese American serving in the Navy, but she had always taken pride in his patriotic service and heroic death. Learning that he had been killed by friendly fire didn't diminish his service, but it did change how she thought about the country he had died serving. My father volunteered to serve a country that often treated Chinese Americans as second-class citizens, she reflected. He proved his loyalty and patriotism by serving aboard a submarine in combat, but when he died, that same country decided his family didn't deserve the truth about his death. It's complicated to love a country that has failed you so profoundly. As the anniversary of the Gudgeon's loss approached in October 2025, the families planned a memorial service that would finally tell the complete truth about their loved ones' deaths. The ceremony would acknowledge both the tragedy of the friendly fire incident and the greater tragedy of the 8-decade cover-up that had compounded their grief. The service was held at the Submarine Memorial in Groton, Connecticut, on October 18, 2025, exactly 81 years after the USS Gudgeon's destruction. Representatives from all 79 families were present, along with current and former submarine officers who wanted to honor the dead and acknowledge the institutional failures that had hidden their story. Admiral Lisa Franchetti, the Chief of Naval Operations, spoke at the ceremony and offered a comprehensive apology for the Navy's handling of the case. The men of the USS Gudgeon died serving their country with courage and dedication, she said. They deserved better than to be killed by friendly fire, and their families deserved far better than 8 decades of lies and cover-ups. We cannot undo the injustice that has been done, but we can commit to ensuring that such institutional failures never happen again. The ceremony concluded with the reading of all 79 names of the Gudgeon's crew, followed by the traditional Navy bell ceremony honoring the dead. As each name was read, a family member rang the memorial bell, the sound carrying across the water toward the ocean where their loved ones had died so many years ago.